The silence of God is not absence, but few know what it means. When God goes silent, most people assume one thing immediately: that they did something wrong, that they failed spiritually, that they missed a sign, ignored a warning, or disappointed God without realizing it. This conclusion forms quietly, almost automatically, and once it settles, it reshapes the entire inner landscape, and that assumption may be the real danger. Silence has a unique way of turning the mind inward, not toward reflection, but toward accusation. You start reviewing your prayers, your choices, your past. You replay conversations with God as if they were exams you might have failed. You wonder where your faith slipped or where your obedience weakened, not because you are unstable, but because the human mind is conditioned to associate silence with rejection. When no response comes, we instinctively search for fault. And when the silence comes from God, the search becomes deeply personal. This reaction feels logical, even responsible. If something goes quiet, surely there must be a reason. Surely something must be corrected. But logic, when rushed, often produces the wrong conclusion. Cartesian thought begins with doubt, not to destroy truth, but to strip away assumptions. And here is the assumption that must be examined before anything else: that silence means disapproval. The moment you accept that idea, everything shifts. Prayer becomes cautious instead of open. Trust becomes conditional instead of grounded. Hope shrinks to protect itself from disappointment. You may still believe in God, but you begin relating to Him through fear of error rather than confidence in relationship. Silence stops being neutral and starts feeling like judgment. This is not comfort yet. This is interruption. Because the most damaging interpretations are the ones we never question. And silence, when misunderstood, quietly trains you to doubt your worth instead of deepening your awareness. It convinces you to look backward for mistakes instead of forward for meaning. But here is the unsettling possibility you may not have considered. What if the silence is not pointing to something you did wrong, but to something you are being prepared for? What if the quiet is not correction, but transition? Not punishment, but positioning? Silence does not always remove something. Sometimes it removes noise. Sometimes it removes reassurance so that maturity can form. If every moment of growth came with explanation, dependence would never evolve into discernment. And if every season came with affirmation, identity would never stabilize. The danger is not that God is silent. The danger is concluding too quickly what that silence means, because interpretation determines impact. The same silence can weaken one person and strengthen another, depending on the meaning assigned to it. So stay with this discomfort. Do not rush to resolve it. Let the assumption be questioned instead of obeyed. Because once you stop assuming silence equals failure, a deeper layer of understanding becomes possible. And everything that follows depends on this shift. Silence feels threatening because the human mind is wired for response. From the earliest moments of life, we learn safety through feedback. A voice answers when we call. A face responds when we look up. Over time, response becomes proof of connection. So when response disappears, the nervous system reacts before the soul has time to interpret. Silence does not feel neutral. It feels unsafe. Modern life intensifies this reaction. Messages are delivered instantly. Notifications arrive within seconds. Delays are interpreted as disinterest. A message left unanswered triggers speculation. Something must be wrong, either with the relationship or with us. This conditioning follows us into our spiritual life more than we realize. We expect God to respond the way the world does, quickly and clearly. When that does not happen, discomfort rises. The mind begins to fill the gap. It imagines distance where there may be none. It assumes rejection when control is lost. Silence removes predictability, and the mind resists anything it cannot manage. That is why silence feels unbearable. Not because God is gone, but because control is. Control gives the illusion of safety. Silence takes that illusion away. When feedback stops, anxiety looks for something to grab. It reaches for explanation, for certainty, for reassurance. Without those, the mind escalates the situation. It asks questions that have no immediate answers and then interprets the lack of answers as meaning something negative. Silence becomes loaded with conclusions that were never spoken. This reaction is human, not spiritual failure. It is a survival instinct misapplied. The mind wants to stabilize uncertainty as fast as possible. But spiritual growth does not operate on the same timeline as emotional regulation. What feels uncomfortable to the mind may be necessary for the soul. Silence forces a shift from external validation to internal grounding. Without feedback, you can no longer rely on reassurance to sustain faith. You must learn to remain steady without confirmation. That is not easy. It feels like standing without support. But that sensation reveals something important. It shows where faith has been leaning on response instead of relationship. This is where misunderstanding begins. Instead of seeing silence as an invitation to deepen trust, it is labeled as absence. Instead of seeing waiting as formation, it is labeled as neglect. These labels shape experience more than the silence itself. Once you recognize this pattern, something changes. You stop fighting the silence as if it were a threat. You begin observing what it exposes, and what it exposes leads directly to a deeper question, one that has less to do with faith and more to do with identity. Silence does not test what you believe, it tests who you believe you are. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Faith can exist without feedback, but identity struggles without confirmation. When silence stretches on, belief may remain intact, yet the sense of being chosen, guided, or valued begins to wobble. You may still believe in God's goodness, yet quietly question your place in His attention. You may still affirm His faithfulness, yet wonder why others seem to receive clarity while you wait. This is not a crisis of belief. It is a confrontation with identity. Silence removes the mirrors we often use to see ourselves spiritually. When affirmation disappears, what remains is your understanding of who you are without validation. Silence exposes whether faith has been rooted in relationship or reinforced by reassurance. This is uncomfortable because reassurance feels like proof. Without it, identity feels exposed. Many people confuse this exposure with spiritual failure. They assume struggling in silence means their faith is weak. But in reality, silence strips away borrowed confidence so something more stable can form. Confidence that does not depend on constant feedback. Identity that does not collapse when validation pauses. This is where silence becomes precise. It targets dependence, not devotion. It reveals where self-worth has quietly attached itself to outcomes, clarity, or spiritual experiences. When those things are removed, the question surfaces naturally: who are you when nothing confirms you? That question is not cruel. It is refining. It asks whether your identity is anchored or conditional, whether it rests on who God is or on how often He reassures you. Silence does not remove God. It removes props. This is why silence feels heavier for those who care deeply. The more sincere the faith, the more intense the exposure. But exposure is not destruction, it is preparation. Identity that survives silence becomes resilient. It no longer rises and falls with circumstances. Once this is understood, silence begins to shift from threat to teacher. It stops feeling like rejection and starts functioning like refinement. And that prepares you to understand the silence itself differently, not as distance, but as a specific kind of nearness that simply feels unfamiliar. God's silence is often mistaken for distance, but there is a difference between distance and withdrawal. Distance implies absence. Withdrawal implies intention. When God withdraws signals, He is not stepping away from you. He is stepping back in a way that allows something new to emerge. Presence remains, instruction decreases. And that distinction matters. Think about how growth works in real relationships. A parent does not stop loving a child when they loosen their grip. A teacher does not abandon a student when lessons become less guided. At some point, support changes form. Words reduce, oversight relaxes, not because care has ended, but because capacity has increased. Too much instruction would actually interfere with development. The same principle applies here. Guidance decreases when capacity increases. Silence often appears at the exact moment when constant instruction would keep you dependent instead of discerning. If every step were narrated, you would never learn how to walk without holding someone else's hand. Silence creates space for internal strength to replace external direction. This is why silence can feel confusing. You are used to signals, to reassurance, to clarity that arrives quickly. When those signals are withdrawn, the absence feels personal. But it is not punishment. It is trust. Trust that what has already been given is enough for this stage. Trust that you can remain grounded without constant correction. Withdrawal does not mean abandonment. It means responsibility is being transferred. Less instruction does not mean less care. It means more respect for what has already been formed in you. Silence is often the moment when God stops doing for you what you are now capable of doing with Him. This reframes everything. Instead of asking why God feels Father, the question becomes what has been entrusted to you. Instead of waiting passively for direction, you begin to notice your own discernment activating. Silence sharpens perception when you stop resisting it. Many people miss this because they interpret silence through fear. They assume something is wrong. But what if silence appears because something is right? Because growth has reached a point where constant feedback would limit maturity. Because autonomy is being allowed, not imposed. Once you understand this, silence stops feeling like neglect. It starts feeling like space. Space to notice what you have learned. Space to choose without constant confirmation. Space to discover that God's presence does not depend on His voice being loud. And in that space, something else becomes impossible to ignore. The inner noise that silence brings to the surface. The thoughts and fears that guidance once drowned out. Silence does not create those things, it reveals them. And that revelation is the next turning point. Silence becomes uncomfortable not because it is empty, but because it acts like a mirror. When external guidance quiets down, internal noise gets louder. Thoughts you managed to avoid rise to the surface. Fears you kept contained begin to speak. Questions you postponed step forward without asking permission. Silence does not create these things. It reveals what was already there. When reassurance fades, the mind fills the space with assumptions. It replays old narratives about worth, fear of being overlooked, anxiety about the future. You begin to notice how much clarity used to calm you, how much affirmation kept certain doubts quiet. Without those supports, what remains is raw and unfiltered. That exposure feels threatening, but it is honest. This is the uncomfortable mirror silence holds up. It shows you what noise was covering. Guidance, structure, and reassurance often act as buffers. They are helpful, but they can also hide unresolved fears. When those buffers are removed, the inner world becomes visible, not to punish you, but to show you where attention is needed. You may notice thoughts like, what if I am not enough? What if I misunderstood my path? What if I am falling behind? These questions feel heavy because they touch identity, not logistics. Silence forces you to confront them instead of drowning them out with activity or words. That confrontation feels destabilizing, but it is also clarifying. This is where many people try to escape the silence. They look for distraction, constant input, or immediate answers, anything to quiet the mirror, but avoiding the mirror delays growth. The questions silence raises are not meant to trap you. They are meant to reveal what needs to be integrated. Ask yourself honestly what surfaces when everything goes quiet. Not what you think should surface, but what actually does. What fears appear when no one reassures you? What doubts show up when no direction is given? What identity remains when affirmation disappears? These are not accusations, they are information. The silence is forcing you to confront parts of yourself that were previously managed by external structure. It is asking whether your sense of worth can stand without constant reinforcement, whether your trust can exist without immediate clarity, whether your faith can remain steady when feelings fluctuate. This is not a test you pass or fail. It is an invitation to awareness. Awareness is the beginning of integration. Once something is seen clearly, it loses its power to quietly control you. Silence brings these things into the open so they can be understood, not so they can condemn you. When you stop resisting what silence reveals, the mirror becomes less threatening. It becomes instructive. You begin to see patterns, not just emotions. You notice what has been shaping your reactions, and that awareness prepares you for a realization that shifts the meaning of silence again. Because silence does not mean you are forgotten, it means something is being trusted to you. This is where the silence feels most personal, not theoretical, not philosophical, personal. Because while others seem to move forward, receive clarity, or speak confidently about what God is doing, you are still standing in the quiet, watching, waiting, wondering if you were overlooked in the process. You may feel forgotten, even if you would never say it out loud, not forgotten in an angry way, but in a slow, confusing way, like being left in a room while everyone else moves on. You still believe, you still show up, but something inside you whispers the question you try not to hear. Did God move on without me? This is one of the heaviest experiences a believer can carry, not doubt in God's existence, but doubt in their place within His attention. Silence amplifies comparison. You notice other people's breakthroughs more clearly. Their certainty feels louder against your quiet, and the longer the silence lasts, the more tempting it becomes to interpret it as exclusion. But silence does not mean you were skipped. It means something is being trusted to you. Trust looks different than reward. Reward is visible. Trust is quiet. When responsibility is coming, preparation often happens in obscurity. When depth is required, noise is reduced. Silence is not the absence of care. It is the presence of confidence. Confidence that you can carry what comes next without constant reassurance. Those who are trusted are often prepared privately, not because they are less valued, but because what is being formed cannot be rushed or displayed prematurely. Silence becomes the space where strength is internalized rather than borrowed, where clarity becomes discernment instead of instruction. Feeling forgotten does not mean you are forgotten. It means the usual signals have changed. The way you measure closeness no longer applies. Silence removes the visible markers so that trust can be built without them. That feels unfair at times, but it is also formative. If God were absent, there would be chaos, disintegration, loss of grounding. But you are still standing, still aware, still searching for meaning instead of escaping it. That stability did not come from nothing. It came from presence that does not announce itself. This is why silence hurts more for those who are being prepared. Because preparation requires endurance without applause, growth without validation, trust without explanation. And those conditions feel indistinguishable from abandonment unless they are understood correctly. You are not being ignored. You are being entrusted, and what is entrusted is never trivial. Silence is not a dismissal. It is a narrowing of focus, a deepening of capacity, a sign that something meaningful is forming beneath the surface, whether you feel ready or not. Once this is understood, silence begins to shift again. It stops feeling like delay and starts revealing purpose. Because silence is rarely about what you lack. It is about what is being strengthened before it is required. Silence often comes before authority, not reward. This is one of the least discussed patterns in spiritual growth because authority is misunderstood. Authority is not visibility. It is not influence. It is not being recognized or celebrated. Authority is stability under weight. It is the ability to carry responsibility without being undone by it. Before responsibility increases, depth must increase. Before influence expands, character must settle. Silence creates the conditions for this. It removes external stimulation so internal strength can form. It reduces noise so discernment can sharpen. It limits visibility so identity can detach from approval. This is why preparation often feels lonely. Growth that leads to authority cannot depend on constant affirmation. If it did, the authority would collapse the moment affirmation disappeared. Silence trains you to stand without leaning on feedback, to decide without applause, to remain steady without reassurance. These are not comfortable lessons, but they are necessary ones. Maturity is revealed by how a person handles weight when no one is watching. Silence introduces weight slowly. Responsibility for your own discernment. Responsibility for your reactions. Responsibility for staying grounded when clarity is partial. These responsibilities are not announced. They are assumed. And silence is where you discover whether you can carry them. God often prepares privately what he will later use publicly. Public moments expose what private seasons formed. If preparation happened in noise, the public moment would overwhelm instead of activate. Silence protects you from being shaped by pressure before you are ready to hold it. This is why silence often intensifies right before expansion. Not because something is being taken away, but because something is being strengthened. Silence compresses experience. It concentrates learning. It forces you to rely on internalized truth rather than external cues. You may feel as though nothing is happening, but something is consolidating. Your reactions are becoming more measured. Your faith is becoming less reactive. Your sense of direction is becoming less dependent on constant signs. These are markers of readiness, not stagnation. Authority does not announce itself when it is forming. It is recognized later by its steadiness. Silence is where that steadiness is tested and built. Not quickly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. Once you see silence this way, it stops feeling like delay and starts feeling like investment. An investment in depth, clarity, and resilience. An investment that will be required later, when responsibility increases and noise returns. And when that moment comes, you will not need constant confirmation to stand, because silence already taught you how. Let this moment slow down without trying to fill it. Nothing needs to be fixed, explained, or solved right now. This is not about extracting meaning from the silence as quickly as possible. It is about letting the silence do what it was meant to do. Recalibration does not happen through effort, it happens through attention. For a long time you may have labeled silence as loss of clarity, loss of direction, loss of closeness. Those labels felt natural because they were familiar. But labels are interpretations, not facts. And interpretations can be changed once they are examined. Silence itself has not changed, only the meaning you assign to it. Begin by noticing what has actually strengthened during this quiet season. Not what you expected to gain, but what has formed anyway. Perhaps your reactions are slower now. Perhaps you pause more before responding. Perhaps you rely less on emotional highs and more on steady grounding. These are not dramatic outcomes, but they are significant ones. Training often feels like stagnation while it is happening. The body does not feel stronger day by day. The mind does not feel sharper with each repetition. But over time, something changes. Capacity increases quietly. Endurance grows invisibly. Silence functions the same way. It trains perception, patience and discernment without announcing progress. You may notice that you tolerate uncertainty differently now, that questions no longer send you into immediate panic, that waiting, while still uncomfortable, no longer feels unbearable. These are signs of internal strengthening. Silence did not remove support, it relocated it, from external signals to internal stability. Reinterpret the waiting, not as being held back, but as being trained to hold more. Not as a pause in purpose, but as preparation for complexity. Complexity requires depth. Depth requires quiet. Silence is the environment where depth forms without distortion. As you sit with this, allow yourself to stop demanding proof. Proof narrows perception. Presence widens it. You do not need to justify the silence. You only need to remain open to what it is producing. When you stop resisting it, resistance no longer defines the experience. Notice how your understanding of God may be shifting as well, less transactional, less reactive, more anchored. Relationship deepens when it is not constantly tested by outcome. Silence removes the distraction of results, so trust can become less conditional. This recalibration is subtle, but it is real. It is changing how you listen, how you wait, how you interpret uncertainty. These changes will matter later, when decisions carry more weight and clarity must come from within, rather than from signs. Stay with this reinterpretation long enough for it to settle, not as an idea, but as a lens. Because once silence is seen as training rather than loss, it no longer needs to be escaped. It can be inhabited with purpose. And when you are ready, the next step will not be dramatic. It will be simple, an internal decision about how you will respond the next time silence appears. That choice, quiet as it is, changes everything that follows. There is a moment when understanding turns into posture. Not something you announce, not something you explain. A quiet decision you make the next time silence shows up. This is not about promising to be stronger or more patient. It is about choosing not to run. The instinct to escape silence is powerful. To fill it, to override it, to replace it with noise, reassurance, or constant searching. But now you know what silence can carry. You know it is not empty. You know it is not rejection. So the next time it appears, the invitation is simple. Stay. Staying does not mean doing nothing. It means observing without panic, listening without forcing meaning, allowing the moment to be what it is without immediately labeling it as negative. This internal commitment changes how silence functions. It stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you move through consciously. You do not need to announce this commitment publicly. It is not strengthened by visibility. It is strengthened by consistency. Each time you resist the urge to flee the quiet, something in you settles a little deeper. Trust becomes less theoretical and more embodied. If you choose to acknowledge this shift, you can do so quietly. A simple inner agreement. A thought like, I will stay present when silence comes. That is enough. What matters is not the form of acknowledgement, but the memory of it when the moment arrives. Silence will return. It always does. But now it will meet a different version of you. One who does not immediately assume loss, one who understands formation, one who recognizes trust without explanation. And that prepares you for the final truth silence has been pointing toward all along. God's silence is not absence. It is trust without explanation. Trust that you can stand without constant reassurance. Trust that what has been formed in you will hold when the noise returns. Trust that your relationship with Him is deeper than immediate answers. Silence is not God stepping away. It is God stepping back, so what has been built can bear weight on its own. What feels like distance is often respect. What feels like delay is often confidence. Confidence that you are ready to grow beyond constant confirmation. You were never meant to need signs at every step. There comes a moment when faith matures into steadiness, when belief no longer rises and falls with clarity, when trust remains intact, even when explanations are withheld. Silence is the environment where that steadiness is formed. Nothing in this season has been wasted. The quiet has been shaping perception, strengthening identity, and refining trust in ways noise never could. You may not have seen progress, but you have become more grounded, and grounding lasts. Carry this understanding forward. Let it change how you interpret the quiet moments ahead. Not as abandonment, but as confidence placed in you. Not as loss, but as preparation. Not as absence, but as trust. And when silence appears again, you will know what it means.